And the county council will come to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
For those present, this is a continued meeting. We had a recess, a reconvening, but I also indicated that the public can be heard at this particular meeting. Okay, you have an optional prayer, Carol?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let us pray. We are here in the presence of God as we gather to do our duty and responsibilities to the people we represent. We do not make the decisions alone as we embark on our journey to lead. We rely on each other to do their part and fulfill all responsibilities of our positions. We will stumble and know that we have much to learn, but with the wisdom and guidance on our voyage together, we will do our parts. We thank our Lord for his part in all that we do. Amen.
Thank you, Carol. Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Anderson?
Here.
Mrs. Fatika?
Here.
Dr. Faust?
Here.
Mr. Horton?
Here.
Mrs. Lowell?
Here.
Mr. Rastetter?
Here.
Chairman Leon?
Here. Next on the agenda, hearing of the public. Mr. Barnes called in, so we'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, Council. My name is Randy Barnes. I reside in Dr. Faust's district. And first, let me congratulate Dr. Faust and thank him and Councilperson Lowell and Councilman Leon for, I don't know, between the Faust family name and those other two people, there's probably about 100 years of experience leaving council. And, of course, with Ms. Fatika and her husband's all those years, we're well over 125 years of experience leaving us. So we're going to depend on, I guess, Andre and Mr. Rastetter. Good stuff. And I'll come back. I'll come back to advise when needed.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
If needed. If needed.
That sounds good.
Thank you.
Can't wait.
Thank
Yeah.
you. But I'm here just briefly talk a little bit about my pet project, or a thing that I feel very strongly about, and that would be the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College. And if you've never had the chance, I encourage you to go to their website and take a look at the student catalog, which is 163 pages that guides just about everyone and anyone through the steps to how to become a student at the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College. Of course, we have a student success specialists within a few blocks of this area that people that have interest are encouraged to go and talk to. In fact, if there's 3 or 4 of those people that really don't know how to progress their way through, I would be more than happy to work with those people, and they can get a hold of Doug, and I'll work with someone if there's people out there that really have a GED, have a high school graduate, and really don't know what to do and would like to get started, because there's something as simple as a Associates of Arts degree where you enroll in English 110, writing 1. I mean, basic things that students can go and get inexpensive credits for, and those credits can transfer. All those courses that you remember taking when you went to college, the basics and that count toward the building blocks of further degrees. But I'm a person that I don't like to see things go to waste. And when I see all of the state helping pay for the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College and us not promoting it and taking advantage of it, I feel that we as citizens of Erie County and many elected officials are wasting taxpayers' money. And I don't think we should waste taxpayers' money. If it's out there, we should try to do everything we can to make it work. And when we find out a reason that can't work, and then we make changes to it, or we come up with something else. But until we find out something can't work, we can't say, I don't like that because I've never eaten broccoli, and I'm never going to eat broccoli because I know I don't like it. We can't be that way. We have to take advantage of the things we have and those things we ask for. I shouldn't have to, but I'll remind you that our current county executive and many people in this room wanted to be part of the NPRC, asked to be part of the NPRC, and was included in the NPRC after that request. And again, as a letter to the editor, I think it sends a poor signal to ask for something and get something unique, and then not take advantage of it. I see the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College as being a model that can change the entire state community college system. If we would get behind this NPRC and show that it works, and show how effective it is, and how cost-effective it is by using existing facilities, the rest of the regional community colleges in the state are going to have to say, well, geez, what can we do to compete with a college that has open walls, such as it is? But I want to say that in closing, that thank you for allowing me this time tonight. I suspect that if your meeting is the last one, the first one in December, I won't see you again, so I want to wish everyone the best of holidays. Those that are moving on to retirement or other careers, I wish you the best. I wish Dr. Faust the best in his new position, and Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else from the public wish to be heard? Anyone else? Once, twice, third and last time? Thank you very much. Report of county officials.
None tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I have a report from Councilman Carl. Go ahead, Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to give a quick report in regards to this past weekend. CCAP held their conference down in Hershey, and just want to send back from the leadership of CCAP to Dr. Faust and Councilwoman Lowell, Councilwoman Fatika, and yourself, Mr. Chairman, that everyone there has the greatest respect for all of you and wishes you well in whatever the future brings after County Council. And Mr. Chairman, many members of CCAP wanted to congratulate you for the years that you worked on the governance committee in pushing for the no-fault absentee ballot, as we had mentioned at our election board meeting last week. And certainly I join my colleagues, as we did last week, to congratulate you on something that you had worked on for many years and should be recognized, that in the Act 77 of 2019 has now become a part of Pennsylvania law to institute a no-fault absentee ballot. And so I also want to thank and congratulate 3 new members of council, Mary Rennie and Ellen Showerman and Brian Shank, who were also able to attend, and Kim Clear was going to attend but had some unforeseen circumstances over the weekend. But all of them were very active and engaged and made Erie County proud. As I was down there and witnessed what they had gone through and the training program that CCAP gives to newly elected officials, which is second to none. So Erie County was well represented, and that's all I have for tonight, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anyone else? If not, let's go on with the meeting. I'll entertain second reading of ordinance 82, Mr. Clerk.
A second reading of ordinance number 82, 2019, 2020 debt service fund budget.
Make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Moved by Carl Anderson, seconded by Mr. Faust, Dr. Faust. Comments? If not, roll call.
On ordinance 82, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Lowell,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Chairman Leone.
Yes. Before I go on, just follow the book is set up so that it's the same as your agenda. Follow the book and you won't have any problems. Next is reading of second reading of ordinance 83. In title only, please, Mr. Clerk.
A second reading of ordinance number 83, 2019, 2020 Employee Fringe Benefit Fund Budget.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call.
On ordinance 83, Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Second reading of ordinance 84, title only, please.
a second reading of ordinance number 84, 2019, 2020 Health Choices Fund Budget.
I make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, second by Dr. Faust. Comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend this motion to include action item 1.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. For the amendment, roll call. Any comments first? If not, roll call on the amendment.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Roll call now on the ordinance as amended.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 85, title only, please.
a second reading of ordinance number 85, 2019, 2020 Mental Health Intellectual Disabilities Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend the motion to include actions item 1 and 2.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments on the amendment? Roll call on the amendment.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Next is vote for the ordinance as amended.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 86, title only, please.
a second reading of ordinance number 86, 2019, 2020 Drug and Alcohol Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Entertain a motion for the amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to amend to include actions item 1, 2, and 3.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments on the amendment? Roll call on the amendment.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Okay, roll call on the ordinance as amended.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr.
That's what, we have to amend the cover sheet.
Yeah.
On which one? The drug and alcohol?
Drug and alcohol.
As soon as they finish the vote on the ordinance as amended, we'll,
No, you want to go back. to
oh, I'm
before.
sorry. I apologize. My fault. You're right. What's the,
6,528,861.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to reflect the cover sheet to those numbers.
moved by Mr. Anderson,
Second.
seconded by Dr. Faust? Roll call?
On the cover sheet, Mrs.
Yes.
Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Chairman Leone.
Yes, now the vote on as amended, the ordinance as amended.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Chairman Leone.
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 87, title only, please.
A second reading of ordinance number 87, 2019, 2020 Children and Youth Services Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to amend the motion to include action items 1 through 7.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Chairman Leone.
Yes. Now it's covered.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to change the cover sheet to reflect all the changes in the action items.
58,552,263. Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. There was only $1 difference there, Joe?
Well, one of the actions is balance, so we can try to balance it.
Okay, Mr. Clerk, roll call.
On the amendment of the cover sheet,
Right.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Now the vote as amended.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Chairman Leone.
Yes. Caught up, Doug? Okay, second reading of ordinance 88, title only, please.
A second reading of ordinance number 88, 2019, 2020 Domestic Relations Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to amend this to include action items 1 through 3.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Roll call on the amendments.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter,
Yes.
Chairman Leone.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to amend the cover sheet to reflect action items 1 through 3.
Little change in that, Joe?
that should be $5,323,631.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? If not, we'll call in the amendment.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Now roll call on the motion as amended.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Okay, I'll second reading of ordinance 89 in title only, please.
A second reading of ordinance number 89, 2019, 2020 Planning and Community Development Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend this motion to include action item 1.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? If not, roll call on the amendment.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Roll call on the ordinance as amended.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
Yes. Next, second reading of ordinance 91. Ordinance number 90, I'm sorry.
A second reading of ordinance number 90, 2019, 2020 Library Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, second by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to amend to include action items 1 through 7.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? If not, roll call on the amendments.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes.
$7,477,319.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to amend the cover sheet to reflect that number.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? If not, roll call on the amendment for the cover sheet.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Now roll call on the motion as amended.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastatter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 91. We're there now.
A second reading of ordinance number 91, 2019, 2020 Public Health Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend this to include action items 1 through 6 and 8 through 14.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call on the amendment?
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
yes,
Chairman Leon,
Yes. Now we vote on item 7. You bring it up as an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I make an amendment to take a vote on action item number 7.
Second?
By Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Fox. Any comments? Roll call on the amendment.
Mr. Horton,
No.
Mrs. Law,
No.
Mr. Rastetter,
No.
Mr. Anderson,
No.
Mrs. Fatika,
no,
Dr. Faust,
No.
Chairman Leon,
No.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we change the cover sheet to reflect all the action items. Public health.
8,749,418.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust to make the change on the cover sheet. Roll call on the amendment.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
yes,
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Chairman Leon,
Yes. Okay, roll call on the ordinance as amended.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
yes,
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Chairman Leon,
Yes. Okay, second reading of ordinance 92.
a second reading of ordinance number 92, 2019, 2020 Public Safety Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make an amendment to include action items 1 through 3.
Second.
By Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call on the amendments.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
yes,
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Chairman Leon,
Yes. No change in the cover sheet?
No change.
Huh?
No change.
Okay, then, roll call on the ordinance as amended.
Mrs. Fatika,
yes,
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Chairman Leon,
Yes. Okay, next is, second reading of ordinance 93.
a second reading of ordinance number 93, 2019, 2020 Gaming Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I move to separate action item number 2 for a vote.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. A yes vote means that you want to maintain all transfer for grants in the gaming fund. A no vote means you do not. Okay? Roll call, Mr. Clerk. on the amendment.
On ordinance 93, as amended, well, action sheet 2, rather. Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
No.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
No.
Mrs. Fatika?
No.
Chairman Leone?
No.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'd like to make a motion for action items 1, 3, 4, and 5.
I have a second to that? Okay. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call on the amendment.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
3, 4, and 5?
1, 3, 4, and 5, Mrs. Law.
Okay, yes. No. Wait.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to amend the cover sheet to reflect the accurate number as,
8,168,687.
687.
687.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Roll call on the amendment for the cover sheet.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 94, liquid fuels.
Mr. Chairman, do we need to vote on it as amended, I
Oh, I'm
believe?
sorry. As amended, yes, I'm sorry.
On that vote, Mr. Rastetter? It's 93 as amended.
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Chairman Leone?
Yes. No changes on that, is there, Joe?
No, you already voted.
We did, yeah.
Next is second reading of ordinance 94, liquid fuels, fund budget.
A second reading of ordinance number 94, 2019, 2020 liquid fuels fund budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call.
On ordinance 94, liquid fuels, Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 95.
A second reading of ordinance number 95, 2019, 2020 Pleasant Ridge Manor fund budget.
So moved.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make an amendment to include actions items 1 and 2.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments on the amendment? Roll call on the amendment.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes. There's a change in that?
No change in that.
No change?
I'm sorry, there's,
No change in that.
No change? Okay, then.
Expenditures.
you already have that, okay. All right. Thank you.
Roll call on the
Mr.
ordinance
Chairman,
as
just before we
amended.
vote, could I say something, one thing, just before we vote?
What's that?
I have the floor just for a quick second before we vote.
Sure.
I've said this just about every year, that of the budgets that we have to put something in as part of the county share, what we yield in relationship to that county share, and for what we get for the people of Erie County, I hope for all that here, like in here and beyond, when I'm off this council, this budget will not be tampered with. This is too valuable of a benefit to the voters and citizens of Erie County. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Other comments? If not, did we do the amendments?
We still need to do as amended, that's all, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, roll call is amended.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Next is second reading of, second reading of ordinance 96, Pleasant Ridge Manor depreciation.
A second reading of ordinance number 96, 2019, 2020 Pleasant Ridge Manor Depreciation Reserve Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call.
An ordinance 96, Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Next is second reading of ordinance 97, title only, please.
A second reading of ordinance number 97, 2019, 2020 Erie County Care Management Budget.
So moved.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend this motion to include actions items 1 and 2.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust for the amendments. Comments on the amendments? If not, roll call on the amendments.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes, there isn't any change on the cover sheet, is there? Roll call on the amendment, or on the ordinance as amended.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. Everyone catch your breath, because we're going into this. Second reading of ordinance 98, title only, please.
A second reading of ordinance number 98, 2019, 2020 General Fund Budget.
So moved.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to amend this motion to include action items 1 through 6, 8 through 41, and 43.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments on the amendment? Roll call on the amendments as presented.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 7.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments, roll call on the amendment for item number 7.
Mrs. Fatika?
No.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
No.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. I don't know what the score was.
4-3.
Fails 3-4.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 44.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Oh.
You can be-
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay,
Yep, I went out of order, Mr. Chairman, but we'll go back.
okay, this is on item 44.
Yeah.
As amended, roll call.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 42.
Moved by Mr. Anderson.
Second.
Seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call on item 42 as amended.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Chairman Leon?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd make a motion to take a vote on action item number 45.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust for item 45. Roll call on that amendment.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
No.
Mrs. Fatika?
No.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes. That one passed.
Fails 3-4.
Okay, Carl.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 46.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Roll call on that amendment.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Chairman Leon?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 47.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Chairman, just quickly before we vote,
Sure, go ahead.
these are funds that the coroner really didn't know anything about, didn't want in this budget, and I don't think council should be putting them there otherwise. Thank you.
Any other comments? Roll call on that amendment.
On action sheet 47, Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item 48.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? If not, roll call on that amendment.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 49.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. For item 49, roll call.
Dr. Faust?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to take a vote on action item number 50.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust.
Mr. Chairman, just very quickly.
Go ahead.
All these 50 through 57 are all new grants that had an opportunity to be able to go through the grant process for whatever reasons. They might have varied, they did not, so I'm not going to be affirmative on anything.
Roll call.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I just want to make a comment on action item number 50, which is a grant, one-time grant for the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement that council did vote on in 2019, and we voted to allocate the money in 2019. However, because the activities are going to take place in 2020, and they could not spend the money in 2019, we chose to put it in the budget and allocate that for 2020 and not for 2019. So that's the addition of this particular item in the budget today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Roll call on item 50.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Chairman Leone?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 51.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I'll be choosing myself from this vote as I serve on the board of directors of the staff.
Okay. Roll call on item 51.
Mrs. Law? No. Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton? Chairman Leone?
Yes.
It ends 3-3.
Yeah, that's Okay, next.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 52.
Second?
By Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call on amendment for item 52.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Chairman Leone?
No.
It fails.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 53.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Roll call on item 53.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
No.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Chairman Leone?
No.
Fails.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 54.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Comments? Roll call on item 54.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
No.
It passes.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 55.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. On item 55, roll call.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
Nope.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
No.
It fails.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we take a vote on action item 56.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. Roll call on item 56.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Chairman Leone?
No.
It fails.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 57.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Dr. Faust. On item 57, roll call.
Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Chairman Leone?
Yes.
Passes.
We have many more.
The
That was it.
action sheet 58 would be a decrease in domestic relations expenditures of $1,020. A decrease in children and youth expenditures of $44,842. A decrease in the library expenditures of $364,272. A decrease in the health department of $246,060. An increase in the revenue in Pleasant Ridge Manor of $1 million.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we amend the cover sheet to reflect those numbers.
Say that again?
Okay, you don't want us to change
approve
it?
those numbers on that action sheet.
You may want to change real estate tax or something, we'll change that statement, so you don't want to vote.
Okay, so we're going into recess now.
Is there a motion to recess, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, we'll stand recess. Let's go. We're back in session. Joe, would you give me those numbers again on the domestic relations, MH, MR, drug and alcohol, so forth?
Okay. Domestic relations, under expenditures, you increased it $1,020.
That's the increase?
Increase, yes.
Okay.
On children and youth, under expenditures, you decreased it $44,842.
Okay.
Under library fund expenditures, you decreased it $364,272. The health department, you decreased it $246,060.060. So total decreases of $655,174, increase of $1,020, and an increase in revenue on the Pleasant Ridge Manor of $1 million.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
I make a motion that we take a vote on action item number 58 with those revised numbers.
Second. Moved by Mr. Anderson, second by Dr. Faust. Comments? Okay, roll call on the amended sheet.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Lowell,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. We need to take another motion on everything that was amended? Or another,
We have
Oh.
to amend the cover sheet?
we did amend the cover sheet, didn't we?
No.
Oh, okay,
Do we do that before action item 59?
Well, you got the votes, you can.
Or should action item 59 be?
Well, action item 59, you don't have to do anything with it, you're not gonna raise anything more than the quarter of the mill tax.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we amend the cover sheet to reflect the changes that we've made in action items 1 through 58.
112,043,394.
Second.
moved by Mr. Anderson, second by Dr. Faust. Roll call on the amended cover sheet.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes?
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Lowell,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes. Now we need a motion for
98 as amended, correct?
as amended.
50.
Ordinance 98, the general fund ordinance.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we pass 58 as amended. I'm sorry, 98.
It's already in. Go ahead. Roll call as
I
amended.
second that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Amending the of the amendment.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Lowell,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Chairman Leone,
Yes.
One correction, the amount of fund balance we're gonna be using is $36,361.
3-6?
36,
$36,361.
that's what we need from the fund balance.
Yes. Even with that, your fund balance is just gonna be under $32 million.
Okay. 32 million? Okay. So we need a quarter of a tax to balance the budget.
That's your next ordinance.
Okay. Not listening. Not hearing anything.
do you want me to give it a second reading, Mr. Chairman, while we
Say that again?
want a second reading of ordinance 99 then, the tax levy?
I have to look at that ordinance. You have one.
I do.
Yeah. I was gonna. I don't know how we're gonna do that if we don't have the millage increase to go in there. Have that.
You have to amend that.
It'll have to be amended.
I thought it was 0.25.
That's what it would be total with that addition.
Okay, so you want me to read this whole thing? That's a motion. Or just okay.
Okay. Go ahead and read the title.
A second reading of ordinance number 99, 2019, 2020 real estate tax levy.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we include the levied real estate rate at 596 mils on each dollar of assessed value.
No.
Or,
5.96.
I'm sorry, I couldn't see that. I wanted to make sure we had enough to cover our expenses.
Wow.
I didn't see the point there. I'm sorry. 5.96 mils on each dollar of assessed value, or a rate of 0.596 on each $100,000 assessed value.
Second to that?
Second?
I have a second. Let's go for a roll call.
On the amendment, Dr. Faust?
No.
Mr. Horton? Mrs. Law? Mr. Rastetter?
No.
Mr. Anderson?
Well, since we know it already failed, even though it's my motion, that I would have voted yes because I believe it was reasonable. I might as well go along with the party and say no.
Nope.
Mrs. Fatika,
For the same reason, no.
Chairman Leon,
What's that? Well, you know, my recommendation is to use $3,275,261 from the fund balance. That's my recommendation.
To set the millage where it was, Mr. Chairman.
And leave the millage exactly the way it was. They can say what they want, but a $32 million fund balance, I think, is more than enough in this county. So I'm recommending that somebody adopt that and we put it in. What's that?
I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Moved by Mr. Anderson, seconded by Mr. Horton. Comments?
My motion is that we leave the millage rate as it was last year, with no increase as proposed by the county executive's budget, and that we take from the fund balance the $3.2 million necessary to balance.
Whatever's needed.
What's needed to balance.
Can you still second that, Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Okay,
And I just had a
go ahead.
question.
Go ahead.
That leaves what in the fund balance then? Was that the 32?
Down about
29.
29. You have to go back and amend the budget then, because now you're making actual sheet 59, a decrease of $3,375,000.
Okay, we can do
You want us
that
to do
too.
that first? You want to amend my motion?
Yes.
What's the total decrease again, Joe?
$3,375,261.
So I amend my motion, Mr. Chairman, to include action item number 59.
That's the, again, Joe, that's $3,375,261, correct? You second his, okay, moved and seconded. Any other comments on that? Comments? Roll call.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Chairman Leon,
Yes. Do you have any other business?
Now you have to do the real estate tax.
Set the levy.
Oh, okay.
Correct, that 5.71.
Move it back to what, Joe?
5.71.
Do you want me to amend my motion that I already
Yeah.
have out there?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to amend my motion to have the levied real estate as 5.71 of mills on each dollar of assessed value, or at a rate of 0.571 on each $100,000 of assessed value.
Moved and seconded. Comments? If not, roll call on the amendment.
Mrs. Law. Sorry. I didn't look up till too late. Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Chairman Leon,
Yes. This concludes it, Joe. Any other comments?
Move to adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
I'm sorry, do we need
Go ahead,
to
I'll listen to
amend
comments.
99 or
Mr. Chairman.
approve as amended?
The cover sheet does not change on
Oh. Never mind, thank you.
112, 043, 394 still.
Go ahead, Carl.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a comment that although I respect the decision that this council has made, and this council has made many tough decisions since I've been here, we have been fair and open to the public, and we know that people have concerns about taxes continuously being raised. It's important that we always have a healthy fund balance. We know that we've had a very good fund balance to date, but I will warn that without having any increase today, that expenses always continue to increase over time. And I just hope that what we're doing here is not just kicking the can down the road, because this council does not make those decisions lightly, and we've always stepped up and said that the buck stops here with us, and we've made the hard decisions. So I hope that this decision is another one of those decisions that turns out to be a correct decision, and that as we move forward, we're able to cover in the future the expenses that will continue to increase in the county. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other comments? If not, we stand adjourned.